Hi, everyone. With the Electoral College meeting today to officially cast their ballots, this is the perfect time to look back at the 2020 elections. So on behalf of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, I just want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. AAAS is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society with scientific experts in more than 90 countries and is a leading publisher of cutting-edge research through its science family of journals. My name is Steve Newell, and I'm a project director at AAAS's Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues, also known as the EPI Center. At the EPI Center, our mission is to make it easier for policymakers and other decision makers to access relevant scientific information and integrate that evidence into their decision-making process. Since April of 2019, we've been working on election security, primarily focusing on three areas: how people vote, post-election audits, and the future of voting. As we launched our work, we had an excellent starting point with the 2018 consensus study report, Securing the Vote, released by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. This landmark report represents the most comprehensive analysis of election security in America to date. Working alongside scientists, nonprofits, officials, and security experts, the EPI Center has translated and disseminated information on election security to more than 1,000 election officials across the country in letters, op-eds, briefings, reports, and direct meetings. In this work, we've also been lucky enough to benefit from the expertise and insight of the nationally recognized experts joining us today. The 2020 elections drew record turnout with over 157 million Americans casting a ballot. Despite concerns regarding COVID-19 and foreign interference, election officials from federal agencies with oversight over election security, national organizations, nonprofits, and vendors described the election as the most secure in American history. Lots of credit for this historic success goes to election officials across the country, ranging from your local county clerks to secretaries of state. Without their tireless and often unheralded efforts, none of this would have been possible. During our conversation today, our goal is to provide evidence and insight to help break down what went right to make the 2020 election such a success and what challenges remain. To break down what we saw before, during, and after Election Day, we'll cover the record-breaking turnout, conducting elections during a pandemic, voting by mail, in-person voting, audits, misinformation, access to the ballot, and cybersecurity. We will cover these issues through an expert discussion panel that will last about 45 minutes before moving to about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. I would encourage you all to begin sending your questions in now using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your window so we can jump right in and get to as many questions as possible during the Q&A. So with that, let me go ahead and turn things over to Anne-Marie Mazza, Senior Director of the Committee on Science, Technology, and Law at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, to tell you a little more about their election security work and introduce our esteemed moderator before we move on to the discussion panel. Anne-Marie, all yours.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for the opportunity to partner with AAAS on today's webinar. Good afternoon. I am Anne-Marie Mazza, Director of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Science, Technology, and Law, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar. Back in 2016, the presidential election exposed new challenges and vulnerabilities to our election system that would require some new thinking and attention by federal, state, and local officials. As such, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation asked the National Academies to conduct a study of our then current system and to make recommendations that would provide a vision of voting that is easier, accessible, reliable, and verifiable. An Academy committee was appointed and led by co-chairs President Lee Bollinger of Columbia University and President Michael McRobbie of Indiana University. The expert panel included computer scientists, election officials, legal scholars, and others. And after almost 2 years of study, in 2018, the committee issued its report, Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy. This comprehensive report offered numerous recommendations for improving the nation's election system, including the need for paper ballots, no use of the internet for voting, the use of risk-limiting audits, and the continued designation of our election system as critical infrastructure. Today, we are joined by several members of that committee, as well as others, who will assess how the system worked in 2020 and discuss opportunities to continue to protect the integrity and security of US elections. I'm especially pleased that President McRobbie will be moderating today's discussion. President McRobbie is the 18th president of Indiana University, one of the largest universities in the United States. He holds faculty appointments in computer science, philosophy, cognitive science, informatics, and computer technology, and has been an active researcher in information technology and logic. President McRobbie serves on several national boards, committees, and organizations. He has received numerous awards and honors and is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the AAAS. I'm delighted to welcome President McRobbie to moderate today's discussion. Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Maza. So let me start by welcoming all those who have joined us for this particularly timely discussion on election security and the lessons learned from the 2020 general election, and which is being held appropriately enough on the day the Electoral College meet to formally vote for president and vice president. And I want to thank the National Academies, the American Association of the Advancement of Science, and the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues for their support of today's event. The 2020 general election was fraught with challenges, perhaps to a greater degree than any election in recent US history. And this was even before the onset of the COVID-19 global pandemic, the resulting economic crisis, and renewed and urgent demands for racial justice. Serious concerns were being raised about how to secure elections so as to ensure their integrity and the public's confidence in them, about vote by mail, early voting, absentee voting, and many other issues, including voter suppression and foreign interference in our elections, all in an atmosphere of highly divisive political discourse. Many of these issues were considered in the National Academy's September 2018 report of a committee on the future of voting called Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy, which Anne-Marie referred to and Steve referred to before, in which 41 detailed recommendations were made about how to improve the election process so as to better secure it and to ensure its integrity. To discuss many of these issues, we are joined today by a panel of 4 distinguished experts on elections, including 3 who served on the National Academies Committee. The topics we hope to touch on include voter turnout, remote voting, in-person voting, ballot access and polling place administration, cybersecurity, audits, and the impact of misinformation. So following our discussion, Drs. Newell and Maza will ask questions of the panelists that have been submitted by viewers. Now, each of our panelists have very impressive career accomplishments in numerous areas concerning all aspects of elections, as well as many other related areas. But in the interest of time, I'll only briefly introduce them this afternoon in alphabetical order. Juan Gilbert is the Andrew Banks Family Preeminence Endowed Professor and the Chair of the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Department at the University of Florida, where he heads the Human Experience Research Lab. And this lab is focused on designing, building, and evaluating computational technologies as they relate to the human condition and reflecting on how these technologies affect society. His extensive experience in election security, including his contributions to the National Academies Committee on the Future of Voting, and has testified before Congress on the security of the 2020 elections alongside representatives from the largest voting machines manufacturers in the United States. Liz Howard serves as Senior Counsel for the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, where her work focuses on election security, and she has testified on election security and election administration matters before the U.S. House Committee on Homeland Security and in a variety of state legislatures. She's also co-authored numerous Brennan Center reports and white papers on topics ranging from federal funding to cybersecurity preparedness. Ms. Howard previously served as Deputy Commissioner for the Virginia Department of Elections, where she coordinated many election administration modernization projects, including the decertification of all paperless voting systems, the implementation of the e-motor voter program, and the adoption of online paperless absentee ballot applications. Nate Persily is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at the Stanford Law School, with appointments in the Departments of Political Science, Communication, and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He was also a member of the National Academies Committee on the Future of Voting. His work is focused on American election law and addresses issues such as voting rights, political parties, campaign finance, redistricting, and election administration. He served as the Senior Research Director for the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. He is the co-author of the leading election law casebook, The Law of Democracy. And he is the co-director with our next panelist of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center, the Stanford Program on Democracy and the Internet, and the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project, which supported local election officials in taking the necessary steps during the COVID-19 pandemic to provide safe voting options for the 2020 election. And our final panelist is Charles Stewart III, the Keenan Zion Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, where he has taught since 1985. He is one of the nation's leading experts in election security and was also a member of the National Academies Committee on the Future of Voting. Since 2001, Professor Stewart has been director of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, which is a leading research effort that applies scientific analysis to questions about election technology, election administration, and election reform. Working with the Pew Charitable Trust, he helped with the development of the Pew's Elections Performance Index. He has also provided advice to the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. And in 2017, he established the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, which applies scientific principles to how elections are studied and administered. So we are delighted and very honored to have four such distinguished panelists with us today. So let's start by addressing the record-breaking turnout in the 2020 election. More Americans voted in the November election than ever before, and about 2/3 of the voting eligible population voted, the highest percentage in any election in 120 years. So maybe we could start alphabetically to get the discussion going, but I'd like to ask the panelists, what do you think we should take away from the sheer size and scale of the turnout in last month's election, and what do you think the implications from this might be for preparing for future elections? So Juan, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Michael. My biggest takeaway is going to be a little different. So we had a record number of participants during a pandemic. What that tells me, we could do more. That's what that tells me. That's how I interpret it. So what I think we need to do, let's applaud that we were able to get through this election and handle the record turnout. But I think we need to be at the same time preparing for the next one, and that it could be bigger in the absence of a pandemic. So that would be my first point, to say, congratulations, we did a great job. But note it was during a pandemic, and let's get prepared that what happens, we increase again. We need to be prepared for that. But we did do a good job this time around. It was excellent.
Liz?
So I would just say, that our election officials at the state and local level did an amazing job of providing additional options for voters to vote. And in essence, in most states, made it easier to vote. And so I think one of the big top line lessons is that if you make it easier to vote, it's going to impact turnout. And how are we going to see that lesson applied across the country is going to vary based on a couple different factors. I think that you will see some state legislatures who expand and work to make voting easier, and you'll see some state legislatures that are going to work to make it more difficult to vote, specifically more difficult to vote by mail.
Knight. You're muted, Knight.
The record turnout is a function of the excitement, might not be the right word, all of the different motivations that were leading people to vote, right? And so people were interested, people were concerned about the future of the country. Donald Trump is a unique force, both on the Republican side and for the Democrats. And so people responded. And so we had record turnout. Whether that's sustainable, who knows? I think, just to echo what Liz said, the fact that we were able to pull off this election at all, let alone with record turnout, is due to the Herculean efforts of the local election officials. And if you go back 7 months and look at what was happening in the primary elections, where we also in some places had higher than expected turnout, but where the election infrastructure was in many respects collapsing because you had places like Milwaukee where 97% of the polling places were shut, that we were able to pull off an election with close to 159 million voters turning out is really a remarkable accomplishment. And so I think, most of the reasons we reached that level are sort of predictable political scientific reasons about what was motivating people and exciting them to get out and vote. But the fact that we were able to sustain it and that we have to administer an election with very few problems given that is really due to the great strengths of the people on the ground who are willing to put in the time and make this election work.
Yeah, that's a very good point about how chaotic the primaries were. I mean, some are not producing results for weeks and months and so on, and then just how well everything actually seemed to come together, just whatever it was 6 months later.
Just to embellish that a little bit. So 97% of the polling places were closed in Wisconsin. They also had to call out the National Guard to staff the polling places. You also, and that's on the polling place front where we had critical shortages of polling places, poll workers. And then look on the mail balloting front, where places like New York City, where they ended up bouncing 20% of the ballots because of disorder and disagreements on how the mail balloting system was working and lack of coordination with the Postal Service. The fact that we didn't see any of those problems at a large scale in the general election is really quite remarkable.
Yeah. Charles.
You're muted.
I'm always that guy. Sorry about that. So I'll first start by just underscoring what my colleagues all said, that this was really quite an amazing election with respect to turnout, with so much going against, you would think going against the possibility of historic turnout. We got it. And given all of the degrees of difficulty within the election administration world, election administrators not only accommodated the historic demand, both in terms of percentage and in terms of numbers. In fact, I mean, the numbers in many ways were even more impressive because of population growth and all those sorts of things. So not only did that happen, but it happened relatively without remark. On election day. So I think it's an election administration triumph. The question is what happens in the future. And again, a couple of political science responses here, large amounts of turnout are reflective both of what the campaigns do and what the voters are thinking. And moving ahead, we can assume that elections are going to be tight, issues are going to be polarized, there's going to be intense interest in the campaigns and turning out voters. On the other hand, we're going to have to see what's going to happen. We'll just have to see what happens over the next 2 to 4 years as there's continued gridlock in Congress, as there is likely, I hate to be a spoiler here, but as there is likely a Republican wave in the midterm, which one would expect given the outcome right now, or the outcome right now, if young voters, Democratic voters who are excited to turn out in this election feel disillusioned after the possible outcome of 2022. So there's a lot to be seen in the future. As Liz was pointing out, there's also going to be a lot of battles in state legislatures over the next few months about whether to consolidate what happened during the past 9 months. And to that, I would just add that it seems to me what I'd argued, and along with Nate, throughout the past 9 months or so, has been we need to think about what just happened as really an emergency, as responding to an existential threat to the elections. And that after this election is over, we need to revisit the election system and we need to ask, what about this we want to make permanent? What about this we want to just say this was an emergency? And I think that it actually would serve policymakers and political actors well if they would take a deep breath and think about what we learned, think about what we learned that needs to be improved, and focused on improving the election rather than to continue what might be the natural habit of people, which is to continue to press for political advantage one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah. which of course, I think in terms of lessons learned, or that could be learned, brings us to really one of the big ones, which is voting by mail. I know we touched on that in the report, and raised some issues concerning it, but of course it's been the focus of some of the most strident questioning of the election, and in spite of what seems to be a complete absence of any evidence of fraud or malfeasance whatsoever. But from the point of view of all of you, and please, whoever wants, please start. From the point of view of all of you, how do you think voting by mail worked and functioned in this election? And again, how can those gains be consolidated for future elections or improved?
I'll jump in. Going into, and you probably can find video of me saying this, going into this election, when we talked about vote by mail, my biggest concern was going to be how many ballots sent in would be rejected. I had concerns about rejection rates. And I think some of you, my colleagues here, had similar concerns coming out of the primaries and things we saw in the previous year, rejection rates in particular. Charles knows this, in Florida, we had some unsettling rejection rates and things, in particular with signature verification, et cetera. To my surprise, the rejection rates were much, much lower than expected. And there were some things to account for that. I'll let Charles talk about that in more detail if he likes. But I think, to me, Michael, the big takeaway on mail-in voting was that overall, I would say it worked. As you said, there's no evidence of fraud at this point. And then for my expectation of rejection rates, those turned out to be significantly lower. And again, being in Florida, that was spot on to see what would happen, and they were much lower. Now, moving forward, again, challenging Charles here, we should take a look at it, and we can improve it. We can definitely improve it. There was a process that I think we give kudos to our election officials, our workers, because when ballots were rejected, and both sides did this actually, in some states, you were allowed to contact them and get it corrected. And there were a lot of that activity helped fix this, but there's still work to do. And I think moving forward, the big question is going to be, with the number of people who voted by mail and it worked, what does that mean going forward? Will they have that expectation going forward? So when I hinted at potentially increasing the number of voters, that's a possibility now that people have, tried this mail-in thing out. That worked pretty smoothly. So wait a minute, maybe I'll keep doing it if I can.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in there since my name has been invoked. And by the way, I'll just note that there's at least 3 of us on this call who can claim to be Floridians in one way or the other. So we could tell Florida stories all day long, I'm sure. Just to add a couple of things to what Juan was saying. I mean, one of the things that happened in this election is that voting by mail got in the spotlight. And up until this point, in most of the country, vote by mail was considered to be a privilege and wasn't particularly curated very well by most states. I mean, a few states did it really, really well, but most states didn't. And I think the primaries put the spotlights on the states with respect to arbitrary and sometimes, just really kind of really high barriers that were put in front of voters. And, kind of the spotlight ended up sweeping a lot of that away, not entirely, but to a large degree. So, and I think that the greater attention to voting by mail will, cause states and localities to revisit their laws, revisit their practices, and kind of get it even better in the future. And so that's one thing. The second thing I would add is that there was an amazing degree of public education in this election. And it started with the campaigns. It went down to the election officials, to the traditional media, and I mean, I have to say also to social media, all working together to remind voters to sign sign the damn thing, to ask for the ballot early and get it back early. And what we saw not only were, one of the reasons why we had so few ballots rejected is that they came in so early, and so very few of them came in late, and that was really quite remarkable. I think moving ahead, we would like to consolidate that gain to make it easier for voters to return their mail ballots on time, to increase the use of drop boxes, to increase the use of ballot tracking, web applications, and the rest, so that in the states that didn't come along, and there's probably about a half dozen to maybe a dozen states that are still lagging in this regard, the citizens and the voters in those states can take advantage of the best practices that were rolled out in the vast majority of states this time.
And this is Liz. I'll just add on. I mean, I think from the big picture, and Charles suggested this earlier, but the states in the West in particular have done an excellent job and have been working on promoting and using almost exclusively vote by mail for multiple years. And the election officials in those states were very helpful to their colleagues across the rest of the country that didn't have as much experience with getting set up for a huge portion of their ballots to be cast by vote by mail. I think one of the reasons why this went so well was because of the public and private funding. Many of the election officials, especially in the East and the Midwest, where they had not previously had huge portions of their electorate coming in to vote by mail, had to spend a lot of money, not just on voting equipment, but additional staff, potentially additional office areas to conduct this process. One of the other good things that we saw from an election security point, I think, is that you saw many states, again, making it easier to apply to vote absentee or vote by mail. You saw multiple states with secretaries of both Republican and Democrat launch absentee ballot application tools, which made it easier for voters to request an absentee ballot and made it easier for the local election officials to approve and process those applications. So I think that some of those very important lessons, again, where we're making it easier for people to participate in the franchise are so important.
Let me just add something. I might take a little different view than everybody else on this, which is that there is incredible polarization around mail balloting right now that did not exist to the same extent before this election. A lot of that, as Charles has shown, is because Democrats now are so much more in favor of it than Republicans. But because of the way the post-election period has shaken out, we are now in a situation where the very idea of mail balloting is triggering a partisan response that I think is very disconcerting. But I agree with everybody about the actual performance here. And the way I think about it is that the pandemic and then the increase in mail balloting and the building of the infrastructure accelerated for some states a trajectory that they were already on. So here in California, where we had 2/3 of people casting votes by mail and then everybody got a ballot, it'll be very interesting to see whether it ends up sticking in California, whether we're going to end up going to something more like Oregon and Washington and Colorado, where everyone is routinely mailed a ballot. But you'll see this divergence, I think, between some states and others. And so it really, the question for me is how much of these changes are going to stick. Are there, and will it, in places like California, I would expect them to. In states that moved to no excuse absentee balloting, like Michigan and Pennsylvania, that was legislation. So I don't think that's easily going to be overturned. But I do expect in some states, and Georgia will be the interesting test case for this, whether there's going to be a lot more security put on the mail balloting process. So asking for greater scrutiny of signatures, greater rules on identification and the like, so that we may see a divergence among states on some of this as to whether they're going to end up going in this direction. But I do think we've now kind of reached a new plateau when it comes to mail balloting that was set with the pandemic, where, you know, roughly, I don't know, let's say 35 to 40% of Americans ended up casting votes by mail. And of course, that's a misnomer, because it's not as if about half of those ballots were not put into the mail. They were deposited in one way or another through ballot drop boxes and the like. And I think one thing I hope that comes out of this election is a greater sophistication in the way we think about the continuum of voting options, from kind of pure vote by mail to pure in-person voting in polling places, and that we've recognized there's a lot of options in between, where people, for instance, could get mailed ballots, but then would return them into polling places, return them into drop boxes and the like, and you know, explore all that sort of different variety of ways. But the polarization is something we're going to be living with for some time on mail voting, and it is something that concerns me.
Nate, I think that's absolutely right about polarization. Sadly, you think something is neutral as how voting happens, that should not be a factor. But obviously, if it's more if one party is supporting it more than another, I guess that's just maybe natural. But are there any things that could be done that might reduce that polarization around mail-in voting at all?
Well, if I can jump in there and sort of make one comment apropos of the previous discussion, and then to address the question directly. I mean, I think one of the things that may have come out of this this election is a greater acknowledgement that there's value to having more early voting, whether that is by mail or in person, both for fiscal reasons, for control reasons, eventually even for cost reasons. And I think that even in the states like Georgia, where they're very, I mean, kind of troubles are brewing, even there, you know, it may very well be that the result will be to just have more people voting in person early, rather than loading everybody on election day. So there's been a lot of learning over the last several years about the value of having it's more resilient, it's cheaper, more secure, et cetera, to have more time. How to reduce partisanship? Well, I mean, it seems to me, and this is just speaking for myself, that one of the places to start is just to, I guess I'll speak to Democrats. Stop acting as if voting by mail is the savior of voting. I mean, I think one of the mistakes made early in the pandemic was that a number of political leaders saw the pandemic, Democratic political leaders saw the pandemic as a way of expanding voting by mail. And the issue was expressed really in, not directly in partisan terms, but in ways that were interpreted as partisan. And so, I mean, it strikes me that if we're going to avoid the partisan brickbats, then we need to think, then I think Democrats need to take seriously the concerns that Republicans have about things like security, which is reflected either in the quality of the voter lists, which determine who gets ballots and what the signatures look like, et cetera, or the security of drop boxes and where ballots are returned. Again, we were doing a lot of things in this last election to deal with an emergency. And I think that there are some things with respect to the control of the situation that many states would not have done except for the emergency. And so kind of separating out the emergency from voting as normal, and to respect the security issues that Republicans that might have, and then you know, understand, I mean, I think on the Republican side, Republican voters as well value flexibility. Even if right now voting by mail is seen in a negative light. Many Republicans are going to remember that they've enjoyed voting by mail in the past too. And so I do think actually there's a possibility of meeting in the middle in many states as these issues get thrashed out.
I would also add that the if you talk to Republican election officials at the local level, there isn't the kind of partisan polarization that you're seeing in the national political discourse here. And so much, all of us work with these local election officials, and the more that we can amplify their voices on these issues, the better, because it's not going away. And for many of them, it's like this is the way they're dealing with long lines on election day, right? Or resource constraints, right? That's one of the reasons for doing it. So there are all kinds of management reasons why mail balloting may be a kind of significant part of the election administration experience. And the more that we could get folks of both parties at the local level. And that was part of the goal of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration now, whatever it is, 7 years ago, was to get Democratic and Republican election officials together to make these kind of management arguments. And increased early voting was one of those arguments that we made.
Okay, so let's move on to in-person voting. Well, I guess this also covers the previous topic in some ways as well. There was a continued retirement of paperless voting systems. In fact, I think Chris Krebs made a comment. I've forgotten the number, 97% or something. Some very large percentages was actually done by paper, which of course is the verifiable part of the whole voting process. How do you think the actual in-person voting experience worked on election day itself, in terms of how the administrators adapted to in-person voting process, especially ones that were had moved even more in the direction of all paper voting?
Well, this is Liz. I mean, I would say, just again, to kind of echo so much of what we've already touched on today, is the expansion of options for voting meant that there were fewer voters for election officials to work with on election day, and distributing those voters over, several days or several weeks versus just having everything focused on election day provided a lot of relief for election officials. I think that, they were very prepared. And the voters, as also has been mentioned multiple times today, there was a lot of voter education done by the election officials, by the parties, and by other interested organizations about what voters should and could expect, and what voters could do at the polls, whether or not that was going to vote in person on paper at the polling location, or whether that was to come in and drop off their absentee ballot they had decided not to mail in. So really, I certainly, from my experience, Election Day 2020 was one of the quietest election days that I've ever experienced.
Remember, we had over 100 million people who, of the 160 roughly million people who ended up voting, you had over 100 million who voted, well, over 101 million whose ballots were received or cast before Election Day, right? And let alone another, I don't know, Charles, what the number would be, another 10 to 20 million, let's say, that probably voted by mail that were received, on that day or in the days after. Let's say another 10 million. So then you're stuck with about 50 million or so who voted on Election Day. Charles, I don't know whether it's something like that. And so that's really does relieve the crunch. But again, remember where we were, which is where we thought there was going to be a complete meltdown. It was people, places, and things, right? We're going to be a shortage of poll workers. There's going to be a shortage of polling places, shortage of equipment like PPE to actually to staff and run the in-person voting experience. It was an unprecedented sort of outside NGO effort led by Power the Polls, as well as several other groups, Poll Hero and National, EAC, NAS, these other organizations, to get hundreds of thousands of new poll workers in the polling place, because, as you know, the average age of a poll worker is over 60 in the United States. They were most vulnerable to the virus. A lot of them would not participate as poll workers this year. And so Power of the Polls got over 500,000 people to sign up. How many of those ended up being the ones that were in the polling place? Who knows? But we know that there weren't poll worker shortages, which everybody had predicted. With respect to polling places, there were a lot that were taken out of commission because they couldn't ensure voting with social distancing. But look at the NBA stepping up and having arenas that were contributed to be vote centers. All other kinds of big box institutions also providing for new polling places. And as Liz said before, the amount of money that came into the system allowed these jurisdictions not to be stingy in keeping some of those polling places open. So the $500 million you had $400 million from Congress, you had almost an equal amount or even more coming from private individuals, right? And private individuals and foundations going into the coffers of local election offices to pull off the election. It was not something we've never done before in this country at that scale. It was absolutely critical in pulling off this election that they had the resources that they need. And it's also instructive for what we need going forward. And really how little with let's say another $1 billion a year, which is chump change in the scheme of things with election administration, what we could do to really make a difference to make the voting experience a lot more safe and equitable.
Well, just to be really clear about this, and a couple of things, Michael, that you mentioned. Imagine a world in which two things hadn't happened over the last 4 years or 9 months. First of all, imagine if we had not been able to expand voting by mail. What election day would have been like? We would have had people still voting at 6 o'clock the next morning. Okay, so we just need to be really clear about for that people who just want to get rid of voting by mail or think that it was just kind of the worst thing that ever happened. It really saved this election. But the other thing, which we haven't talked about, but you had in your question, imagine if Nevada and Georgia still had the machines they had 4 years ago, which were electronic machines without any paper trail. Imagine what the recount in Georgia would have been. I mean, there's controversy enough about that they're ballot marking devices, and there's controversy about that, and I understand that. But if there had been no paper, I think that the conspiracists would have been having an even greater field day, and more mainstream voices, I think, would have been in the mix wondering about the result of this election. And so, I mean, I think it just talks about, it reminds us there's something to be done over the next 4 years, if not sooner, which is to retire all the paperless voting systems, because there, but for the grace of God, goes some other place that still, hasn't upgraded, right? And so, we just got, I think we learned from this election is that we really have to get rid of those systems.
Liz, you want to comment on that since you've actually, taken a sledgehammer to some of them?
Well, I mean, in good news, we only have about 8 states that continue to use paperless voting machines. And this is I'm gonna give it a whirl here, but I think that we're at Indiana, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, Tennessee, and Texas.
It's parts of Indiana.
Kentucky is almost finished its transition over to paper-based voting machines. Louisiana is working forward on doing a procurement to purchase paper-based voting machines for the entire state. And the other states that were included in that list, there are only a small number of counties where paperless voting machines are still used. But of course, right, again, as has been mentioned, our election infrastructure was under strain prior to the pandemic because of the deprioritization of our election infrastructure and the lack of ongoing funding that it has received. And so there, state, local, and federal government absolutely have to prioritize election administration so that our election officials can afford to purchase more secure, better voting machines. And, I was in Georgia for the risk limiting audit, and I had the opportunity to speak with some of the people on the ground that were very concerned about any number of potential problems that could have happened with the voting machines. And they were there to observe the audit, which was in essence a hand recount of all the ballots cast across the state. And they were very appreciative of that, and they understood that doing this hand count was going to address the concerns that they had. So, again, this, it was a lot of work for election officials, but I think that up and down state and local election officials in Georgia are very happy for the risk limiting audit that they conducted and for the procedures ability to, allow for voters to retain confidence in their election systems.
The arguments for paper voting on paper, paper record, and so on, they don't, as far as I know, you people are all the experts. They don't seem to have become partisan. Those particular arguments. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a partisan divide with one party saying no, that we should be all paperless machines. That's the best way to do it. Is there any evidence of it becoming partisan? Because if it's not, then hopefully there's a chance of actually getting rid of the last machines by the 24 election.
Well, this is Liz, and I'll just say again very briefly, right, that our understanding based on the election officials that we've talked to is that it's not a partisan issue. In fact, it's a financial issue. They don't have the funds that they need to purchase the new equipment and maintain it. And I think one of the last state election officials I saw mention this issue was Republican Secretary of State Adams in Kentucky, who said he had never seen such bipartisan support for any other measure that he had advocated for.
Well, you know, the interesting what you're hitting on, Michael, is that conspiracy theories have been bipartisan over the last 20 years, right? So there was, you know, we go back to 2004 and the post Help America Vote Act period, right? It was Democrats who were worried about the lack of paper trail. Now we have Republicans. One thing though, and this is to a glass half empty kind of comment, which is that when you ask the question, like, what can we do to get more bipartisan spirit and sort of bipartisanship and public opinion toward a lot of these election reforms, you know, the problem is that even under a extremely well-run election like this, we're still seeing incredible polarization and opinion about whether the infrastructure held up or not, right? And whether people believe the results. And so, you know, all of this fiction about Dominion voting systems, for example, right? And how that plays out, there's really, you know, I actually don't even understand the argument completely about what the problem is. But that's even in the context of a paper trail. So Chris Krebs can spend all of his time tweeting about how, look, there were paper records. They did two-hand recounts, right? And nevertheless, the conspiracy theories are taking hold. But that still amplifies what Charles was saying before, all the more so imagine if there weren't paper records, right? Imagine how people would have reacted otherwise.
Juan, you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I'm in agreement 100%. I couldn't add anything more. I'll just say this, and I think our report was pretty clear, but let me say it a different way. Given the current state of technology, there is no known way to man how to secure an electronic or digital ballot. Period. We have to have paper. Until there's scientific evidence otherwise, no, this is not. And Charles is right. If we had not had this paper trail in Georgia, because remember, Georgia was uniform statewide and they were DRE. Can you imagine? Oh my goodness, it would have been a nightmare, catastrophic. So yeah, I'm sticking to our report. We strongly recommended paper. And I feel I'm gonna pat myself on the back, and Charles, Nate, Michael, we're all getting pats on the back, because it shows that we were right in this instance. Thank God that they had paper in Georgia, for example. So yes, and I'm gonna say it one more time, Michael. We do not know how to secure a digital ballot. It cannot be done. If there's anyone listening and watching who thinks you can do it, send me an email. I'll be happy to review it and take a look at it at your method. Blockchain can't do it. There is no way to secure a digital ballot. You show me what you think works, and I'll show you how I can break it.
Wonderful. Let's move on to access. And now, I think it's widely believed that the minorities, African Americans, Latinos, citizens with disabilities, and so on, have greater barriers to being able to vote. Something that has been highlighted and obviously has elicited a certain amount of controversy in some areas. In this election, do you think any of those gaps or those barriers were reduced or lessened? Did it become, in spite of having to deal with the pandemic and everything, did it become easier in any ways for minorities and the disabled to vote, or did we see it become more difficult in this election?
I'll jump in first. I don't think it became necessarily more difficult. I think vote by mail helped in some respect, but again, looking at data coming out of Florida, my colleague Dan Smith did some analysis again on mail-in ballot rejection rates. First of all, ages 18 to 23 had the highest rejection rate on signature. And so if we're right, Nate, that and Liz, if we do see more people participating in mail-in, we have a big tidal wave on the horizon of younger voters who they didn't grow up like we did, accustomed to signing their name. And so we're only going to have a higher rejection rate in mail-in. With respect to people with disabilities, there was greater participation. I haven't seen the exact numbers. I need to talk to my folks at Rutgers and find out the data. But we have seen an increase in participation of people with disabilities due to accessible voting, an increase in accessible voting options. Now, I haven't seen the data on their participation in mail-in yet. I don't know if Charles or Nate has seen that yet, but I know where to get it. I'm just going to go to Rutgers to get it. But yeah, I think this election we saw access an option, and a lot of that had to do with mail-in. But in person, I'm not ready to give a big applaud on that, because we saw in certain areas they reduced the actual number of polling places. And that was not by accident, I would say. I was saying it was strategic in certain areas, I believe in Wisconsin in particular. So I'll just end there.
Yeah, I'll amend a little bit what Juan was saying, but first embracing the suspicion, or at least the hypothesis, that communities of color, I mean, certainly had greater challenges in voting in this election, and may not have been as well served as other communities. I mean, these are things that, people like me, and I mean, a lot of folks are going to be studying this over the next couple of years. I mean, I'm, the Wisconsin closure of the polling places in the primary, for instance, I actually have to say I have a hard time seeing that as strategic directly, but I also think that it's a really great example about how systemic racism affects voting. And that is to say, the parts of Milwaukee, for instance, that were under under the greatest strains, and in fact, the parts of the parts of the cities that were under the greatest strains are minority communities, low-income communities, underserved communities. And so when there's a strain like, when there's something like the pandemic that hits, social inequality focuses on the communities that are already, disadvantaged by circumstances. And so, I mean, it seems to me that that's certainly the case. We need to see whether the degree to which the closing of polling places, the opening of arenas, vote centers, et cetera, were accessible to people without access to public transportation, other ways of getting there, et cetera. Finally, I mean, it is the case, as far as we can tell, that the shift to voting by mail was primarily white voters shifting to mail. African Americans voting early tended to vote early in person more so than voting by mail, or at least, I guess, more accurately, did not shift to mail as much as white voters did, and even white Democrats. And so, we need to be aware of all of that. And I think that's something for scholars to be looking at over the next couple of years, about what the consequences were, so that, if there were untoward consequences, that we don't repeat those in the future.
And real quick, let me just annotate what I was saying earlier. At Rutgers, it's Lisa Scher and Doug Cruz. I don't think they released their report yet. They have a report that they do every major election on people with disabilities participation in an election. So once that report comes out, that's something we all can look forward to see if those numbers shifted. And Charles is right. I haven't seen, Charles, any data yet on people with disabilities, their shift towards mail-in or not. I haven't seen that, but I know states were preparing and making that available for people with disabilities, but I don't know the participation numbers yet.
Right.
I say is one thing, which is that voter turnout appears to have gone up with every group. The question is relatively, how big were the relative gains? And I think that we should not, this is going to take a few months for us to figure this out. And the exit polls, well, the AP Votecast and the exit poll actually disagree with each other as to what the composition of the electorate was. And it does remain to be seen. I didn't realize what Charles had said was true. I didn't know that. I thought that the male voting population was likely to be somewhat less white this time than it was previously, because historically it had been so white. But we'll see, whether that's true or not. Certainly on the advocacy front, there was it seemed like there would have been an increase in African Americans and Latinos who would have been voting by mail, but it may be that the shares again are small because of the massive increase in voting, particularly among white Democrats.
Nate, did I hear you correctly? Did you just say we need a commission study on the 2020 election? I think that's what you just said.
Did I say that? I don't know. I mean, let me tell you, I don't know what it is, my gluttony for punishment or what, but every year, every 14 months or so, I end up being on some kind of commission. And so, it's just a matter of time. We'll see what it is.
Liz, you want to comment on this topic?
I'll just say that, it's a mixed bag, and we don't, have all of the information yet. And I think that, when we get, when, Nate and Charles and Juan have an opportunity to look at this data, we're going to find there were some state and or local election officials that had better procedures than others as far as making sure that every voter had an equal chance to participate. And I think that election officials are aware of the historical voting patterns of various different groups. And I think that's part of the reason why you saw election officials fight so hard in some areas, right, to maintain and potentially expand in-person voting and early voting during the November election.
I'll say one thing from what I put as my kind of top travesty when it comes to access for this election was what happened with Florida with respect to felon reenfranchisement. Because in Florida, they passed a law that would have eliminated the previous, disenfranchisement, and that was basically halted in complicated ways to ensure that people then would pay their pay restitution, or pay not even restitution, that they would pay some money that they otherwise wouldn't have to. Long and the short of it is the dream that had been fought for years to try to eliminate felon disfranchisement in Florida was delayed. And that really, from the standpoint of access, I thought was quite a travesty.
Well, as we speak,
but Nate, again, that goes to show one thing that I put a positive spin on it. There were a lot of people who paid those fines for those individuals too. So people stepped up from that respect. So just to be clear, in Florida, I'm here and I was in the middle of all this. So essentially, the state voted and gave them their right. And then it came about that they said we couldn't let them vote unless they paid their fees. And there were outside individuals who paid a lot of those fees. So that was just another form of the silver lining there, if anything.
So as we speculated, there's no way we can get through all these questions, but let me move to what I think is obviously a big one that we may end up finishing on, and that's the cybersecurity of the election. We all know that Chris Krebs, with whom we met, of course, when we were presenting the report on Capitol Hill and to the agencies, came out and said, I think, words to the effect it was the safest and most secure election ever, and then probably got fired for saying so. But the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency really seems to have played a major role in defending the election. Do you want to comment on CISA and the role that it's played, how important it was, lessons there for future elections, and then maybe also at the sort of semi-independent from that, the election infrastructure, ISAC as well, the role that they play, those two organizations. As far as I can see, I've tried to track this stuff as best I can. There really don't seem to be any claims of any major cybersecurity incidents, and I'm aware of, certainly not in the public domain. And that really is to the credit of all the people who quietly, I think, behind the scenes were doing such a good job of protecting things. But you want to comment on those issues?
Well, this is Liz. I can kind of contrast where we are today versus where we were in 2016 when I was the Deputy Commissioner of Elections in Virginia. And even shortly after that, when basically all of the paperless voting machines in the Commonwealth were hacked at a White Hat Hackers Conference in DEF CON. At that juncture, there had been some publicity about potential Russian efforts to interfere with our elections. DHS was not on my call list of organizations or entities that could be a partner or provide any sort of assistance to us in Virginia when we were facing that really challenging period right after DEF CON and shortly before very important statewide elections in Virginia on paperless voting machines. And that, that has completely changed right now. I hardly know of any election official that hasn't at least met Matt Masterson and or Chris Krebs and or doesn't consider CISA and DHS a partner in their efforts to make their elections more secure.
I'll only say that Matt Masterson will now be joining us at Stanford. So thank you for that intro. But realize the breadth of their portfolio, though, Michael. This is what I don't think people quite appreciate, is it's not just dealing with the infrastructure. They were also dealing with the disinformation problem, right? So they had rumor control. This is something we started up at Stanford. One of the reasons Matt is coming over is we started this election integrity partnership with University of Washington, Graphica, and the Atlantic Council to deal with disinformation with respect to voting, which is another thing that CISA and this group was trying to deal with. So it's really amazing that they were, in charge of both the security of the information ecosystem and then also the hardwiring of the voting machines and the like. And one thing I want to just highlight for those on the call who aren't as aware of it, right, is that when we tend to think about the security of the election, most people gravitate toward thinking about the voting machines themselves. But so much of the effort that CISA and the group was involved in is securing every aspect of that system, from the voter registration system to the electronic poll books to the reports, right? The election night reporting system and the like. And so there was a lot of technology that was involved, in many ways, more technology this year because we were in a pandemic situation, right? So that there was even more, and a lot of this was rolled out at the last minute. And so the fact that we didn't have any significant incident is really remarkable, and due to their hard work and partnership with the local officials.
Yep.
Nate, I agree. And Liz, whenever election official I talk to, they know all those people, they've been connected. So let's take a step back. Going into the election, myself and others said the biggest area, and where do we see the biggest threat of cybersecurity? It was in the electronic poll books and in voter registration databases. That's where we had our biggest concerns. To knocking on wood, so far, I don't know of any big claims that there was something done in those poll books or in the voter registration databases. And we'll have to wait and see. I think as we kind of hinted here, Michael and Steve and Anne-Marie, we might want to do this again in a year, actually. Because what we're saying today, we may know a lot more within a year as we look through things. But from what I understand right now, and my colleagues on the panel, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't seen any instances of penetration in the voter registration databases during the period of the election to be noted that I know of. I haven't heard allegations of voter registration, people showing up to vote and their registration being denied a bunch of group of people or a party or something like that, things we were worried about. So, I think, I'm not saying that people didn't try to do that. I'm saying that there were, I'm backing what Liz was saying, the work between the professionals and our election administrations, they were working closely together, and I think we were successful.
Yeah, I remember in our discussions in the committee, the point being made that one of the ways one can affect the credibility of an election is just by causing chaos at the polling stations and so on, through compromising the poll books and so on. And as I think Nate was saying before, one of the smoothest and least eventful elections ever, surprisingly.
This is also one of the advantages of having so much early voting, right? Which is that if you have more than 100 million people voting over a space of a month, that if there are problems, you can detect them early. It's also more difficult to get at that swath of voters, right, in an undetected way, because it'll get picked up.
Now, I've been told that I could just raise one more topic before we move to questions, because there's one of the questions anyway, which is about audits. Of course, one of the recommendations of our report was to use risk limiting audits systematically, and we of course saw a lot of material about that, and talked to the people from Colorado and so on about what they were doing. Obviously, auditing of a type took place in Georgia. What after the election? What takeaways are there in terms of how well or otherwise Georgia used the procedure that they used to audit the election afterwards in that state? Liz, I think you started talking about this before. Do you want to start?
Sure, and I'm very interested in my colleagues' feedback too, because I was on the ground, so it's hard to know kind of like what was going on outside. But you know, from my perspective, you know, the Georgia Secretary of State had an opportunity to do a pilot program, and he had moved forward with implementing regulations that would, in essence, require a risk limiting audit after this November election. Secretary Raffensperger has been a proponent of election security and a proponent of risk limiting audits. And when there were questions raised after the election, Secretary Raffensperger, under the regulations, had discretion to select any race that he wanted to, any of the statewide races that he wanted to conduct an audit. And he chose the presidential, which was not going to be the easiest for him or any of the local election officials in the state. And actually, because we were doing the ballot polling type of risk limiting audit, in essence, it was going to be more efficient for election officials, instead of trying to go and find individual randomly selected ballots and then count them, to just count all of the ballots by hand. And in Georgia, this you know, certainly factored into his consideration, because in Georgia, the recount laws, which are separate from the post-election auditing laws, do not allow for hand recounting of ballots except under separate circumstances. So in Georgia, a recount would and is basically running the paper ballots back through the electronic tabulators. Whereas with the risk limiting audit procedure, he had more discretion and more authority to determine how this procedure was going to be conducted. And, you know, the election officials were, you know, very, very exhausted. And there were a lot of observers certainly at the counties that I got to go to, that were very interested and in large part very appreciative of the election officials' willingness to conduct a full hand count of this audit, so they could address some of the concerns that had been raised. So I was very impressed with the election officials. And I think that the flexibility of this procedure is something that other state election officials and other state legislatures are looking at closely after Georgia.
The one thing I would add, I mean, I think that, I mean, I agree with everything that Liz said. Again, you know, imagine if Georgia not only still had the old DREs, but there wasn't this provision that actually made it easy to kind of do a hand recount before certification. I agree with, I mean, all of that. I think, you know, one of the struggles of risk limiting audits is, well, one of the promises of the risk limiting audits, and one of the things that sells it to legislators and especially to election officials, is that in almost every case, it requires less work than a recount, or even especially a traditional, say, 1 or 2% audit. And so that's how you sell it. It's less work and more powerful. And so the first time Georgia does it, what do you get? You get the most work and the least efficiency, right? And so, I mean, I think in terms of the politics of kind of showing that this is a good thing that you want to do, I'm kind of agnostic actually about whether the Georgia situation is going to help sell the procedure to election officials in other states because of this immediate escalation to a recount, although it was absolutely the most appropriate thing to do. And so, if this were another world, if Georgia could have, if it had been a landslide and, they only had to look at 100 ballots, I think that would have voted better for the future of RLAs in the country. So, we just have to see about how the politics works out. But I think Georgia, again, dodged 2 or 3 bullets in this election at the end.
Yeah, I would say, piggybacking on what Charles and Liz just said, let me try and spin this a different way, Charles. Let's try this. Let's go back a year, and a year ago, and Nate, I'm gonna throw you in here too. If we had to say what state would be contentious in 2020, how many people would have picked Georgia? I don't think very many people, other than experts, probably would have picked Georgia. They said it could turn blue, but it wasn't a lot of belief in that. So here's the way I would put it, Charles. For all states, you could be next. The fact that they had the paper ballots, the fact they were able to do this audit, going back to what Charles earlier commented, if they didn't have these things, it would have been turmoil at a level we can't imagine. So if I'm Secretary of State or election official in some state, I'm looking at this and maybe we should start talking about our procedure and protocol for risk limiting audits moving forward. Because what if we're the next state that is called out? And remember, a lot of this can be fueled not necessarily by a margin of victory, but it can be fueled by allegations and misinformation and things like that. And by having these paper records, by having that protocol, you get yourself out of that hot water. So I would encourage all states to develop a protocol and procedure around risk limiting audits in case you are called out. So here's the question. If you were Georgia and substitute your state, how would you handle this?
So by the way, on that really quickly, although I grew up in Florida, I'm a native Georgian, and Georgians talk about the time we had 3 governors. And so Georgia has certainly had electoral shenanigans in the past. And so I agree entirely. Who knows what state could benefit from something like this and at what time in their history?
Well, but just so people are on the same page, I mean, Liz went through the history here. So there have been now 2 recounts in Georgia, at least 2 this time, right? And so that what ended up being a recount was triggered by the fact that they had the power of to do the risk limiting audit, and the only way to do that when you have such a close election, or not the only way, but the likely way to do it is to count all the ballots. I think that unfortunately, what we've seen is that despite the fact, right, that we've had 2 recounts in Georgia, nevertheless, if you are hell bent on believing the conspiracy theories, right, that that is not going to solve it. But I think that in any of these states where it was this close, and you see what happened in Wisconsin too, where they did the recount in the 2 counties, that there was going to be a way that you were going to have something approximating an audit or a recount in the event it came down to this close in the presidential election.
And this is Liz. I mean, I'll just note the personal toll that this is taking on the election officials, especially in Georgia. The state election officials have been subject to death threats. Many of them have security around the clock now. Local election officials in Georgia, as well as other states, have been subject to death threats related to their administering this election. And absolutely, there are some that are not going to believe, no matter how many times we count the paper ballots in Georgia, who the winner really is. But I think it's important, and we've mentioned this multiple times, like how important the actual local and state election officials who are administering these elections and who are standing up to these allegations that there was fraud or that there was misconduct or there were problems with the election and what they're doing for our democracy.
Okay, look, that was just terrific. Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to pass to Steve now, who's going to sort of moderate the questions from the audience. And Steve, I just need a minute or so to finish up. Don't worry about it. Use all the time we've got available for questions to our distinguished colleagues.
We've covered a lot, but I think one question that came up is whether this is the most scrutinized election in American history. And, given that level of scrutiny, how can we increase confidence in the results? We've already clearly, talked about the audits that have been done and the level of, scrutiny applied to every level. What can we do to reduce kind of misinformation, increase confidence in these results, which are clearly the accurate results?
I think we still gotta study these. Again, as Nate says, we need a commission on this. We need to study this. It's far from over. I do think we need to do more research on it. And I'm taking a different perspective. I am very appreciative of the fact that this was so scrutinized. It was so closely watched. To me, that helps provide evidence in the sense that so many people were watching. If there were things that were happening, the probability of someone noticing and just not saying anything is very unlikely. If something was going on, people were going to scream to the mountaintops if something was happening. So I think that's an actual good thing, Steve.
If I could jump in here, and I don't want to say take issue with the question, but just to point out that the question itself, the question that Steve asked, is a very common one, and I think it's actually a very complicated one, in some ways fraught. And that is to say, we say we want to increase confidence. Well, among whom? I mean, one of the things that political science has discovered, for instance, is that the thing that will increase your confidence in the election the most will be if your guy won. And so all we need to do is just make sure that everyone's candidates always win. And that will increase confidence. Even if the machines are lousy, even if people don't have access to voting, even, you can go down the list. And so, and the research that I've done, other people have done, has shown, for instance, that people who vote on paperless DREs love them. And if you decommission them, people are upset and are less confident in the next time they go and vote. And so I think this issue of voter confidence in the area of election administration is very fraught, and we have to think very, we have to think very hard about it. So one answer to a question like this is, how do we increase voter confidence? If you think voter confidence is a very important thing, making sure that the right person is declared the winner, then there are audits, there's good machines, there's good procedures, there's good things that we should do. If the question is, how do we instill in the public confidence in the outcomes? The research says, first of all, we need the losers to admit they lost and to be gracious in losing. And there are things in society, there's culture, there's a lot of things that go into that I think are a bit, more difficult to change. And I'm not quite sure we have a good sense about that yet, except to say that, one little bit of research seems to suggest that actually local election officials are the most trusted voices in election administration. And so maybe one of the ways we can do it is figure out ways to amplify the voices of local election administrators and make them more visible in their communication with voters about how elections work.
I'll say that.
Sorry, go ahead, Nate.
Well, one thing on this, with and repeating a little bit what Charles said, is that, look, the people's confidence in the election is a function of the signals that they're receiving from elites that they trust, right? And so the more that there are signals that are being sent to the mass public that you shouldn't trust the results, whatever the authentic performance of the system may have been, right, where there's only so much that we can do. And this election is really proving that, because the signals about what you should distrust in the election are so fast and furious and coming from so many corners. Everything from dead people voting to mail balloting to signature problems to Dominion voting systems and the like, and Hugo Chavez. It's all there, right? And if you have elites who are sending those messages, we shouldn't be surprised that people are picking them up. Having said all that, we can take some pages out of books of elections in developing countries, where they confront these problems all the time in areas of extreme distrust. There are certain things that were sort of rolled out in this election, like live streaming of the vote counting process, which I think is actually a helpful thing, right? You know, that it's the more, you know, I don't think we're going to go back to a time where you're not going to be able to see, you know, who has been counting votes, and it's not going to be smoke-filled rooms and the like, right? That not only will they be 6 feet away as they were in many places, but I think greater of that kind of, I'm calling it surveillance, but transparency in the vote counting process. Similarly, increased use of technology in the mail balloting process for the tracking of ballots, right? I think is you know, that was rolled out in, I don't know, a third to half of the jurisdictions in this election, but that I think is going to become ubiquitous as mail balloting improves, so that we'll have greater coordination and control and observation of where the ballots are in each part of the process.
Great. One of the questioners in the chat mentioned that their experience with emergency management administrators and how vital a resource they can be for county clerks. So we are wondering, what other resources could county clerks take advantage of, or what are some additional places county clerks can receive help to help them in their jobs? As you know, Charles mentioned, they're vital components of the election system. They're the most trusted. So what can we do to help them, and what resources should they be looking at?
I mean, this election, I think we had more available resources for state and local election officials than, again, certainly I ever remember. First off, we have federal resources with CISA and various other federal government entities, mostly including the U.S. Election Assistance Commission that worked closely with CISA and closely with election officials. So then you also have NASEM, the National Association of Secretaries of State, and the NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors, that work to go out and kind of aggregate many of the resources that a variety of NGOs put together on any number of topics. So there were a couple of nonprofit organizations that were focused on expanding vote by mail, for instance. And so that entity, Vote at Home Institute, right, put together guides about how to, right, quickly ramp up this process, and worked with election officials across the country on different types of voting equipment and what was going to work for them. And then you had organizations that actually this year put staff into the offices of the local election officials. So former election officials went and worked across the state in these, most of them were major metros across the country, to help them with what they were doing. I think that the local election officials should have a reasonable amount of awareness of all of the different resources that are available to them. And so much because of our decentralized system, the resources that the individual election officials need are going to vary greatly. So it's kind of incumbent upon them to at least be aware that the variety of resources exist for them, and then connect with people that will help pull together whatever they need.
I think, is it still the case, Charles, that roughly half or so of election officials, right, or roughly half of counties, the chief election official is a part-time job? Now that's just because, you know, so much of the counties are you know, rural counties that we're talking about here, but people tend to think, when they have in their mind of who the chief election official of a county is, it's someone who's, you know, like, I don't know, Dean Logan in Los Angeles, or, you know, or talking about like Lisa Dealey in Philadelphia, people whose full-time jobs. But, you know, for many people, this is just one job among many that they hold, the recorders of deeds and the like. And so those organizations that Liz was mentioning were absolutely critical this year. And I think, you know, the rush of money that was coming from private individuals led to a kind of a system of support that hadn't existed in previous elections to this degree.
And this is Liz, just to you know, go back to what Nate said. Based on a Democracy Fund survey, the typical election official is a white woman aged 50 to 64, making about $50,000 a year. and as Nate said, has multiple other duties other than just elections. So for instance, in Texas, I think the county clerks are also responsible for cattle branding and any number of other interesting to-dos.
So another question we have in the chat is about voter registration. So how did our voter registration systems hold up during the 2020 election, and what modifications or alterations would you suggest for those systems, or what policy considerations should we look at moving forward for voter registration?
Well, one of the things that was particularly challenging with voter registration had to do with the shutdowns associated with the pandemic. And so, during presidential election years is when you get, in a 4-year cycle, you might get half of your registrations in the presidential year, and you might get 3/4 of those in the just a few weeks preceding the primaries and then the general elections. What we saw, for instance, during the shutdowns in the spring was registrations just falling off the table. In a number of states that we were following, just no registrations were being done. You couldn't go to the Department of Motor Vehicles. You couldn't set up a table outside the grocery store. You couldn't go door to door, and it was problematic. Now, over time, we know things loosened up. The campaigns got going. People could go to the DMVs, et cetera, and most of the backlog was made up, and maybe not all of it. What it does look like it happened, though, one of the things that helped was that a number of states over the last several years, well, actually over the last decade or so, there's been a rise in online voter registration. And the states that it seems that were the most resilient and robust in this period were those that had flexible online voter registration systems, and so most of those are tied to the DMV, but not all of them are. And so again, I think one of the lessons here, when we think about technology, stay away from the voting machines. The application of that technology is in this connection of the voter to the election administrator. And I think we saw that in this election. The places where that connection was the most robust were the places where it remained possible to register anew, to update your registration, to request an absentee ballot, those sorts of things that you have to do in order to vote in the first place. Most places, still a few states don't have online voter registration, and I think this election was an illustration about why all states should have a variant of it.
I'll add one thing on speaking from Silicon Valley, which is that what the platforms did to facilitate voting registration may have been significant. I don't know actually how significant it was. Certainly from their press releases, it was significant. But the Voting Information Center at Facebook served in some ways. I don't think people quite appreciate how rich an ecosystem they built that then could be spun out for obviously voter registration, poll worker recruitment, all kinds of other civic ends, as well as confronting disinformation, because they were able to, when there were questions about vote fraud, a lot of the counter narratives would come out of the Voting Information Center. It's also where Facebook says that they registered well over 4 million voters. And I'm sure Google and the work that they do with the civic API that Democracy Works puts together also was absolutely critical. And you have to think that during a pandemic, for the reasons that Charles said, where face-to-face voter activities shut down, that these digital tools probably were in high use. And what I think also is going to be interesting is when we started asking the question originally about what sticks on the legal regime side, some of this tool building is going to stick, right? So that Facebook is going to have, the idea that in the next election, they're going to do less from the standpoint of like a voting information center seems off the table to me, that it's only going to build on the successes that we saw this time.
Great, thank you. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Michael for a few closing thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of quick remarks. Firstly, to thank all of our panelists for participating in this wonderful panel today to give us the benefit of vast experience and knowledge about this topic. I think all of us agreed that that there are hundreds and thousands of election officials across the country who really do deserve the gratitude and thanks of the whole country for all that they did, all the contributions that they made in their individual states to make this one of the most safe and secure elections ever, and also, as someone pointed out in the panel, also one of the quietest too in terms of activity. I think the comment, one thing I'll just comment on is the comment about mail-in voting. On the one hand, as maybe Nate said, it saved the election to the sheer number of people who voted that way. Probably reduced, or would have reduced the chaos that could have happened in the various polling stations all around the country. At the same time, I think Charles's point before about because there's so much controversy about it, actually taking seriously the concerns about the possible weaknesses in it, and trying to strengthen those, to address those concerns. It clearly is an enormous important part of the whole democratic process to be able to vote that way. It doesn't have to be complete mail-in, as Nate pointed out. It can be some partial hybrid in between system, but being able to assure people this really is safe and secure, at least rational people, this is safe and secure, really seems to be worth the effort as well. I must say finally that for those of us who are involved in the National Academies Committee, I think our recommendations stood up to the test of an election pretty well. I dare say if we were doing it all over again, there'd probably be a lot more recommendations, but I don't think there was anything we recommended that was proved by experience to have been really false or wrong in any way. In fact, in many ways, I think was exactly spot on in terms of the experience of the election. So again, my grateful thanks, and I know that of the Academy and the AAAS, to all of our panelists today for a wonderful panel. So back to you, Anne-Marie or Steve.
I'll go ahead and take over. So I just, that's all the time we have, unfortunately. So I just want to thank, Anne-Marie Mazza and the National Academies for their, vital election security work. I want to thank Michael McRobbie for moderating our conversation. Again, I would recommend that if you have not read through Securing the Vote, the National Academies report on election security, I would recommend that you do so. As Michael mentioned, those recommendations are as vital today as they've ever been. I just also want to thank all the experts who joined us today for their tireless work, helping ensure American elections are accurate, secure, and as inclusive as possible. Although the 2020 elections are over, and it'll be 4 more years until our next presidential election, election security does not come to a halt during that time. Liz Howard has written about the need for consistent, sustained funding for elections previously. Could not be more true. As the COVID pandemic continues, her work on pandemic-focused cybersecurity preparedness and technical support is also essential for all of the election officials out there still working to secure these elections. Juan Gilbert's work on open source technologies, such as his recent work on his transparent voting machine, brings a lot of much needed innovation to the ongoing conversation around accessibility and security in voting, both of which are of course essential. I would also encourage people to visit Nate's Cyber Policy Center at Stanford, as well as the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. And of course, please also I would recommend that you visit Charles Stewart's Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project for its continuing analysis of the election. As our experts mentioned, a lot of the work on the 2020 election is still to be done as we analyze what happened and look at voting patterns, things like confidence, and kind of continue to break down those issues. So, of course, as I mentioned, our experts are going to be continuing to work tirelessly, and I look forward to seeing what else they put together. So, again, thank you for your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything any of us here can do to help you in your election preparation work, or if there's any evidence we can provide on the challenges that you're facing. So I would thank you all again for your time this afternoon. Thank you.